Hi everybody, hope you did okay. Now the Nike Pegasus Plus here, aka Turbo 4, is much awaited shoe by a lot of people, including me, because I've had the original one here, the Pegasus 35 Turbo from 2018. I've had the next one, the Pegasus Turbo 2, which is the ones I've had most use out of, I would say. And then I even got some good use out of the Pegasus Turbo Next Nature in 2022. So roll on now 6 years from the original one to this one. And this is a shoe that I'm really wanting to like, but it's just maybe just coming up slightly short of what I was perhaps hoping for. But I think that you have to bear in mind, say compared to the Turbo 2 especially, that it's actually now much more morphed into sort of what I would call a lightweight daily trainer, whereas I would call this one definitely much more sort of a tempo shoe. I think by modern day standards, you would even call this a bit of a super shoe. I mean, the main problem is that compared to the Turbo 2 to this one, in my size UK 13, this is 50 grams heavier. It's also wider at the base, which also makes it sort of less racy. So I think very much now a shoe that has a slightly different use case, I think, to the original versions of the Turbo. Perhaps in a way, that's why perhaps a good thing to call it the Pegasus Plus. And is it really similar to the Pegasus standard here, 41? Well, in a way, not really. I think it's just got the same name. It is, the actual sort of feel of it is somewhat different because of the Zoom X. Much more softer feeling in the Turbo, or the Plus. I keep getting that the wrong way around, don't I? But it's also quite wide here now, I found. So although it's got this fly knit at the top here, I'm finding for my narrow feet, it's not quite the sort of lockdown that I like. And so the base is sort of quite wide. But having said that, it's a shoe that the other day I did 7 miles in, and you think, well, that's pretty amazing. But there are some reviewers out there that say you can't take it past 6 miles. And I think, well, these days we just get so sort of caught up on these big stack super shoes, don't we, with these really soft high stack foams. Shoes like the Super Plus 2, which I can't try because I don't do my size, meant to be the bee's knees. But sometimes you kind of feel like this is a shoe with 35 at the back, 25 at the front. And that compares originally to, it was like 18 at the front, 28 at the back, and same as the Turbo 1. This is actually the same outsole. So it's sort of gained, what, 7 mils there, still a 10 mil drop, and yet we still think this is being like low to the ground. Well, it's not really low to the ground at all, really. I mean, I sort of feel a bit of ground feel on it, but you know, maybe just sort of imagining that a bit these days. I think the problem for me with it is that it's a shoe that I feel like should be fast, but it's not. So I think you need to almost get that out of your head and thinking, if I just want a daily trainer that's a bit lighter than the standard shoes, maybe, like say the Pegasus or the Vomera, if you're coming from the Nike angle, you want something a bit lighter on foot, but not too much lighter on foot, still gives a reasonable amount of cushioning, then this would be the option. And you could also obviously take it up for the tempo day, stuff like that. It wouldn't necessarily be a shoe I wanted to be taken for my fastest days, but at the moment my fastest days are sort of something I need to sort of look forward to again because I'm being a bit injured. So in that sense, perhaps it's not a shoe that right now is actually the best one for me. It's very much a neutral shoe. Very much, I think, in the sort of the feeling like the SL2, and you might say of the 2 shoes, which one should I get? Well, I think I prefer the Turbo, but then again, this one is like best part of £60 cheaper. The SL2 is a very good shoe for the price, especially. I just feel like it was just slightly sort of more sort of flat, as it were, if that makes any sense. I'm just sort of like compared the 2 on feet, but I think there's also an element of like, I'm a bit of a Nike fanboy, I have to admit. So I think any shoe that comes out from Nike, even if it's not a shoe that I actually like at all, like the Ultrafly or the Zoomfly 3 and 5, I'm always thinking I want to like it. And this is very much a shoe that I'm wanting to like, and I do like it, but I think it's not the best shoe ever. And I have to admit that of all the Turbos, I think the Turbo 2 is definitely the one that I would actually sort of reach for every time, just because of the fact it is actually serving a purpose as something that's radically different to just a normal standard daily trainer, but also one that didn't have the plate in it, and you feel like you could save your best shoes like the Vaporfly for your race day. Let's have a quick look at the shoe, and also pretty worth comparing it to the original one, because I mean I got the same colorway because they look from visually very similar, and the back slightly different at the back. I think the big difference now is that the current Plus is actually slightly heavier than the original one. For my size, it's about 333 grams. The original one was 315, the Turbo 280. And bizarrely, the Plus and the Next Nature are pretty much identical weights, 333, both of them, almost to the gram. I think also the fact that it's actually got slightly wider, if you see there, compared to the Turbo 2, and the Turbo 1 was the same. And I think in a way, although people like rather slated the Next Nature, I think there's a lot of vibes that have been taken from the latest Plus version from the Next Nature. If you see here at the back, the two shoes are actually much more similar to the sort of more sort of squared off here that had the separation problem. And even though you've got full Zoom X in this shoe, I would say that on softness feel, the softness feel is kind of quite similar between these two. I would say that the Turbo 2 is maybe just slightly firmer in a relative sense, and I think the sort of on the relative terms the Next Nature was the firmest, but yeah, only because of the fact that as I realised that the Next Nature doesn't actually have the removable insole. All these ones otherwise, including the standard Pegasus, have the exact same insole. So I think a lot of the softness doesn't necessarily come from the Zoom X in these shoes, it actually comes from the actual midsole, which is quite interesting when you actually think about it. And then I read an article from Run Repeat, and I think I'd have to agree with them, having thought about it. So, as I said, we've got flywire here, and I've got these sort of quite tight already. So I do feel that for a narrow-footed person, not the best of fit, but I think for everybody else it would be absolutely fine. And I think this flywire stuff is sort of stuff that when you put it on originally, it feels quite firm and quite tight, and it soon sort of starts loosening it out. So every time I put these shoes on, I have to sort of like cinch them in quite tight. As such, that the laces are fine, and I think at some point I may even decide to cut them off. But unlike the first version, you don't quite have the wrap around with a flywire. I don't know if you can see that on the original one. This is much more sort of traditional lacing here. These laces are quite thin, which is quite nice in a way. It makes them sort of lightweight, but there's not really anything to wrap around your foot here other than the flywire. So the actual lacing is just really pulling it in the middle. I think the racing stripe, people always said, oh, that sort of caused it to be feeling a bit shallow on foot. And I think certainly when I first put them on, the new pair that is, I did feel it was slightly shallow when I first put them on, but it soon went away. And I think when I tightened them up, this sort of lifted up a bit, so I've got absolutely no problems there at all. I do sort of quite like that sort of racing stripe. I mean, it doesn't really serve any purpose, but it does sort of like when you look down, especially when it starts getting a bit dark, you can kind of sort of see your way a bit more in that sense. So you have got full Zoom X, as I said, 35 mils at the back and 25 at the front. But I think it's slightly negated as being a fast shoe by the fact it's sort of this move now to these wider platforms. I do wonder whether that's because of the Zoom X partly, because previously in the past, the React at the bottom here, I think that acted as a pseudo plate, which I think in a way that made it such a good shoe. It almost was like a cheaper version of the Vaporfly, because you had this sort of like unsaid plate with the React foam, and then you were sitting on top of the Zoom X, so you had that sort of soft feeling, but then you had a bit of rebound from the road. Having said that, when I went up and down my own road in one of these on one foot, one of these on one foot, I put up a video there, it did feel quite similar, to be honest. And what was remarkable, I did over 500 miles in these ones, and they still felt like really, really soft, and I thought I could use them more. I think I've run more miles in this shoe than any other shoe I've ever had. In terms of the feel on foot, I do feel like as soon as you put it on, you kind of notice that wider base, and you feel like it's not a shoe that immediately wants to lift you up. It is quite bendy, having said that, and I think interestingly, like the Turbo 2 I thought was the most bendy. I mean, you can almost bend that in half there. The Turbo 1 also, and similarly. I think the Next Nature changed things, so it didn't sort of bend from the centre of the midsole, it bended more from the forefoot, so probably that slightly changed the nature of it for you. But if you compare that to, say, the SL2, I think the SL2 bends much more like the Next Nature, much more under your forefoot. So I think in that sense, you're going to get a slightly different feeling. I think maybe there's a case that I need a bit more runs in this to actually start feeling that toe off. And I think also the fact at the moment I'm only running sort of 830 miles. So I'm not exactly burning down the road. I'm not really using the shoe for its intended purpose, I think. I think it's really intended to be for those days when you are wanting to go a bit faster. But having said that, it works fine for going slowly. That run was on a particularly wet day, and I've cleaned these up a bit, and it's now fine. What's interesting at the back, it does say Pegasus Turbo. I think there was a move recently for Nike to sort of move to their premier lines like the Pegasus, the Vomero, and I think even the Structure, and then having plus versions of them and premium versions. So this is the first one of that. So I think originally this was going to be called the Pegasus Turbo 4, and they've even like designed the outsole. It's probably, I'd imagine, just too late to change the design. It was just too expensive to change that lettering. That's what I have to imagine. Or whether that's just a bit of an Easter egg for people like me to talk about the shoes. But you can kind of clearly see that they were trying to achieve that sort of same original look and feel of the two shoes. And I think the Turbo was always a shoe that was very much sort of, you either liked it or you don't. I remember looking on the reviews on Nike UK website when the last days of the Turbo 2. And for a shoe that was sort of so loved by many sort of shoe tubers and YouTubers, the actual reviews of them were pretty poor. I think it had this separation issue, although I did wonder whether a lot of people were trying to kick off their feet, like pressing down on there, which is obviously just doing that now is going to separate them. You've obviously got no such problems there. They've kind of built this up quite sturdy at the back here. So I don't see any problems. It's quite a stiff sort of structured heel counter. There's quite a lot of padding at the back here. And then that's going back to the Turbo 1 days. Maybe not quite as much padding as the Turbo 1. And the actual tongue itself is quite sort of thinner on the Plus than it was in the original one. The Turbo 2 went completely the other way. It took away virtually all the padding at the back, and it took away all the padding on the tongue, just a sort of paper thin tongue, and the upper was very streamlined. So it allowed it to save a lot of weight as you sort of made it effectively a faster shoe. So I think they've kind of gone back to that more plush feel and wanting to push this one, maybe not too fast. So I still think really there's still a bit of a gap now for a shoe between a standard daily trainer and say the Street Fly. I mean, you could easily have a shoe that's sort of 50 grams lighter than this one for me, which would be more like a sort of like one of the original Endorphin speeds, which were about 280. So yeah, I think it's still like, yes, this is a good move from Nike to have something that's a bit more up tempo, but it's very much still pitched, I think, to sort of a more general market, someone looking more to use this every day. In terms of the outsole, you've obviously got good rubber coverage at the front and the back. You've got this exposed middle bit here, which I'm still slightly worried about because I've already had a bit of a puncture mark there, if you can see, where I took it on, well, I don't know, I think it was just running down the road or a little bit of off-road bit. I did used to like the Turbos for like off-road running on old railways, sort of like gravel tracks, stuff like that. So I think you could do that on there, but I'm a bit worried that this would cut up. But on the other hand, when you buy a running shoe and already you're going to get mud on it, you're going to get mud on heels, I've going to clean these up a bit, and I think you just have to accept the fact that, you know, the shoes aren't for looking at on the shelf, are they? They actually are for running in. So yeah, I think all in all, really, this is a shoe that I really wanted to like, and in a way, at the moment, I just can't get the most out of it because I'm not able to run fast enough to actually use it. So I'll be looking forward to more of that. But having said that, it will still be 50 grams more than the Turbo 2. And I still think it will be a shoe that I won't be wanting to take out on my fast days. But, you know, say you went on holiday, you went on a trip, you only take one pair of shoes with you, it would be absolutely fine for that. And, you know, in a session, doesn't really matter that you're 1 or 2 seconds slower over a mile than you would have been in your race shoes. You just want to get through the session, don't you? So is this a shoe that you're looking to pick up? Were you a fan of the Turbos? Have you got the SL2? Do you think of these two, which one do you think is the best? I think also this perhaps would, the Plus now comes into the class of shoes like the Max 6, the Rebel V4, ones like that, sort of lightweight, sort of daily trainers. I think the Noosa Tri that Andy FOD runner has tried. And I think to a certain extent, it comes back to what I said earlier, that there's a lot of brand loyalty here with these things. When I tried the Max 6, didn't really like that low drop. I would say also that it's got this 10mm drop, and it doesn't really feel quite the 10mm drop like it does in, say, the Pegasus. I think it's just because it's a slightly sort of softer feeling of it. So if you're one of these people that claimed only serious runners run in low drop shoes, well, I never quite understood that because I've run for 40 years in 10mm drops, and when you look on all the sponsored athletes that are either Nike or Adidas, so most of their shoes are of the 10mm drop stake. So yeah, if all elite athletes were suddenly wearing all Hokers and all had low drops, then yeah, maybe that might explain it, but they're not. So I think there's a bit of element here that I like this type of shoe and you don't. This way is my way. So I think really, again, it's very much a personal thing. If you like a Nike 10mm drop shoe, then this probably perhaps feels a bit more like an 8mm drop shoe. Still feels like it's got a reasonable drop there, but you know, not like a sort of like a Brooks Ghost, something like that, where you feel like you're almost on high heels, which at the moment, for me, with Achilles issues, is quite an important factor. Anyway, perhaps I'm waffling on a bit now, but as I said, I'd be really interested to hear whether you've actually got a pair of these or thinking of them. I think they come in 4 different colours on the UK website, but I thought I had to get this one, similar to this one. I did have originally the original green pair, I'll probably put up a picture of that one, but this is the pair of shoes that I've only got about 100 miles in, so yeah, maybe one day I'll actually come back to that. And this one, I think, having said the Next Nature, I think of all the 4 versions, it's actually the one that fits me the best. Perhaps also I found it quite good for sort of like old railways as well, but yeah, maybe one that, so in a way I thought I'd persevere this one just to prove a point that you can actually run it. I did do about 200 miles in it. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting. Like and subscribe with that, and see you in the next one then. Bye.